Hey everybody, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out today and joining us for this genre and Westerns event. My name is Kelly Jo Brick. I am the Vice Chair of the WGA Genre Committee, and I'd also like to invite you to an event that we have coming up next week, Tuesday, 6 p.m. virtually. It's our next Genre Committee meeting. Come join us, meet your fellow genre writers, and that's where we brainstorm and put together events like this one, a YA event we did earlier this week. We also have events coming up on superheroes, sports, animation, all kinds of great stuff. We'd love to have you come join us. A quick thank you to all our panelists for their generosity in sharing their time with us, their insights, and experiences in the Western genre. Also, thank you to our subcommittee who helped bring this event together, and to Greg, our liaison for the WGA. He just works so hard to help us bring these events together. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, the person who brought the spark for this event to our committee, and she shepherded it all the way through. Our moderator today, Phyllis Strong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. We've got a really exciting panel for you, and we are going to be talking about how to tell stories in a Western context without falling into those familiar and stereotypical tropes that are culturally unacceptable today. And we're going to talk about how hard it is to make a Western and what classic or contemporary Westerns have been influencing our writers' writing. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Julia Roushman, who was co-executive producer of The Sun and has a lot more credits, but that's what we're interested in her for. Alfredo Barrios Jr., who has a number of credits as well, but we're interested today in talking about his various Western projects, including a Zorro modern day retelling and a modern day neo-noir. Then we have Anthony Flores, who worked on who is the chairman of the Native American and Indigenous Writers Committee and worked on The Deputy, which is a noir Western crime drama, and is also working on a Western project as well. And finally, we have the terrific Lauren Ruggiero, who is the SVP of Original Series at Paramount Television and is responsible for overseeing Yellowstone and its spinoffs. So that's what we have her here for today. So thank you very much. And Julie, if we could start with you. The Sun told the story of a Texas landowner and oil man, Eli McCulloch, and his family in 1915 and flashback to 1849 when young Eli was a captive raised by the Comanche. How did you avoid the stereotypes and include underrepresented perspectives in that?
The show was incredibly fortunate to have a very close relationship with the Comanche Nation. And there was an incredible woman who unfortunately is no longer with us. She passed last year. Her name was Juanita Pataponi, and she was the president of Comanche Nation College and a very distant descendant or relative of Quanah Parker. And she was our liaison to that community. So every time we needed any piece of advice, what the teepees looked like, what the paint on the horses should look like, all the little cultural details, and then of course the language, because a third of our cast was Native and spoke their lines in Comanche. So Juanita helped liaison between the elders in Lawton, Oklahoma, which is the base of the Comanche people today, and our production. So all of our scripts, there were 20 episodes. So there are 20 scripts that contain translated and written Comanche that does not exist anywhere else in the world, we're told. because when we would write a line, a joke, a swear word, that the elders would have to get together and figure out how to actually translate that into Comanche. And sometimes it was the first instance of them all getting together to do that. So that relationship like buoyed us and informed everything about the show. Pierce Brosnan had a very close relationship with them as well, really the entire cast, and they were on set often. So that was that was basically how we did it, is we just brought them into the family and listened to everything they told us, and really wanted them to feel like this was their show too, and that they were represented in the way that they chose.
I also noticed that you portrayed the Mexican family as not as stereotypical Mexicans, and also you had a LGBTQT character as well. So if you could address those, I don't know if those came from the book or if you were expanding on that.
A lot of it came from the book. We had the incredible gift of Philip Meyer's like incredible novel as source material. So a lot of it came from there. And he was very determined in that book that everyone is flawed, everyone is human, everyone has triumphs, everyone makes mistakes. So just coming from that basis, which we all just should take for granted, but unfortunately we still have to speak about in these kinds of ways, like the way that you create a great character of any race, of any nationality, is make them as specific and detailed and human as possible. So yes, we also had a large Latinx portion of our cast and crew, and they were very involved. The translations into Spanish became a very particular project, because it couldn't just be the kind of Tejano Spanish that's spoken today. It had to be Tejano Spanish from 1915 and from a very particular region of Texas. So that also required a lot of research. We're all research nerds on the Sun. So there were huge stacks of books, and it was just this extraordinary opportunity to delve into the history of this incredible state. Pierce Brosnan's oldest son, who you reference, was the gay character in the show. All the research we did on gay life in Texas in 1915, and it was illegal at the time to be gay, and the punishment for sodomy was hanging. So that was all that added all of this weight to the importance of our storytelling. And we all felt this extraordinary responsibility to be just very particular in how those stories were told, because these were parts of history that are often not portrayed on television.
Thank you, Julia. Lauren, I assume that you're doing the same things with Yellowstone and its early spinoff, Why 1883, and perhaps its other spinoff that I don't recall at the moment. But if you could address how you're trying to avoid the stereotypes and include perspectives from historically excluded groups.
I mean, I would say that it's exactly, what Julia is saying, is that just making sure that, in 1883 specifically, without giving too much away, there are a lot of facets to 1883 that don't necessarily exist in the current, Yellowstone. There's a lot of the immigrant perspective. There's a lot of, the Native American perspective. We do have that in Yellowstone, but it will be a major part of 1883 as well. It's really a huge, show that has females at the forefront, and what it was like to be a woman, in the frontier in that time. And any woman, it's hard enough being a woman nowadays with all of the modern technology, let alone in those times. And Taylor really, really gets into the nitty gritty of what it's like to survive as a woman in a time like that, you know, suffering against all the elements and also trying to be a woman at the same time. It's very difficult, childbirth and all the things that we go through every day. So yeah, I mean, it's 1883 is in and of itself a true story of like frontierism and what it meant from all aspects, from, you know, white families to Black families to immigrant families to women to Native Americans. So it really covers the gamut in a very interesting, but also highly, highly entertaining way. And I think that's what Taylor Sheridan is just so good at. It really has a great deal of broad mass appeal. And I think people are going to love it.
I'm sure looking forward to it.
Mm.
Alfredo, do you have anything to add about trying to avoid these tropes and all in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because actually a few projects that I'm working on right now are heavily influenced by, I would say, like the traditional Western that we probably all grew up watching. My mom had like no boundaries with respect to like the kinds of movies I could watch at whatever age. So I remember being quite young, like a little kid, and watching, you know, High Plains Drifter and, you know, Pale Rider and, you know, these, you know, I guess what we call them spaghetti Westerns, right? And they were all subtitled or dubbed in Spanish, by the way. And I watched them at a theater downtown called the Orpheum Theater. So it was quite a memory for me. But they made quite an impression, right? Because I think that when we think about the Western genre, it's a really impressionistic genre. Really, it leaves its mark, right? And fast forward, you know, a few decades, and I start to think about story ideas, and I start to realize that I'm actually going back to some of those like Westerns as inspiration. But instead of, you know, Clint Eastwood being the archetype for the Western hero in my version of the Western, it just happens to be, in one instance on the project that I'm working, a Mexican cop from T1, right? So I realized that I was really influenced and loved the genre, but I also realized that I felt the need to kind of remake it in my own way and kind of like appropriate it in a way that was significant and personal to me, that where, you know, we could kind of flip the script on things, right? We all know that the traditional Western, you know, dealt in tropes and stereotypes and cliches, and you know, I think a lot of the most exciting stuff that's going on right now with respect to the Westerns, whether they're kind of in the more traditional, like, you know, period pieces, like The Sun, for example, which I really enjoyed, or like the neo-Westerns that we're all like big fans of, right? Like whether it's Yellowstone or Hell or High Water or No Country for Old Men. I think the Western feels particularly relevant right now. You know, I think that you know, the Western often posed the question to us as the audience: who are we as a country? Who are we as a people? And I think that, I mean, for me personally, I feel like that's why the genre is kind of speaking to me at the moment, because it was a genre that kind of dealt with those issues actually head on, right, in this very period way, but I think is now having some particular relevance given kind of like the social issues that we're dealing with right now, you know, and our own examination of our own history and our own past. So you know, that's how I've been kind of influenced by the Western, and how I've been kind of thinking of shaping it in my own way with my own kind of personal kind of input into it.
Great. And Anthony, you're working on projects too that flip the script or do things in a different way, given your background?
Sure. Yeah. I think for myself and most other Native people who want to write Westerns or Western-inspired dramas, I think it's pretty easy for us not to fall into any real tropes or stereotypes, because most of us want to write the story from the Native perspective. And often we, generally understands that the Western characters, female characters, were tougher than and those perspectives are easier to tell from our own experiences naturally, to not fall into some of those gender or sexual stereotypes, because just from our own lives we understand that that's not how it is and that's not how it's been. But obviously media portrayed the Western in a certain way for a very long time. And I most recently read an article, I don't know if anybody saw the GQ article by Tommy Orange about West Studi. And, he started it off talking about Dances with Wolves. And for me, I didn't grow up with Westerns, but the first Western I did see was Dances with Wolves. And we both, in that article, both, understood and saw ourselves on screen. That was the first time we saw ourselves on screen, most of us, in any sort of light, historically or contemporary. And because of the humanization of our people in that film, regardless of what people think about the white male fantasy of it all, we connected with those characters. My cousin and I, we dreamed of being the natives at the end who killed all the soldiers and were running into the river. We played those games. And so now when I'm working on projects, I just know that when I come from a Native perspective and understand character from what are the wants, what are the things that are important to us, what are the historical and factual things that happened, it's pretty easy not to fall on those traps of stereotypes. But at the same time, there's a lot of things about Westerns that are entertaining and keeping those characters simple, even though underneath there's probably a lot of emotion and things that are the stoicism. Some of those tropes are really useful, I think, in Western storytelling, in the sense that we can just flip the perspective and still tell a Western genre story, but because of the character's wants and goals and who they see as the bad guy will naturally come out as opposite to what people are used to seeing. So, and I guess I'm inspired by the Westerns I have seen, which are Hombre, Elzana's Raid, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, all very non-Clint Eastwood, non-John Wayne type of Westerns, which actually in my mind really did the best they could at the time to tell the Native perspective in those stories. And so those are my inspirations, but that's also where I come from in terms of storytelling. And then, then we just say, hey, what are ways we can flip the characters around and tell this story in a new, cool way. So it also doesn't feel the same. And I think in Deputy, and I think in the project that I'm working on as well, that's something that's always in the back of our head, which is what is the trope and how can we maybe use it to tell a good story, but at the same time tell it from a different perspective. And I think so that's what I'm doing in my work.
Julia, did you find that certain Western tropes were helpful to you on The Sun?
There's a certain, yes, I mean, absolutely. The short answer is yes. There's a certain shorthand in the genre that an American audience in particular just innately understands. Like you open a story with a stranger comes to town and people understand what they have a certain expectation of what story they're about to be told. And then you can use that to your great advantage to flip it to present a new perspective within that paradigm. So yes, some of the tropes are helpful, but we, especially on The Sun, we felt a real sense of duty to like undercut as many as we could. um, but yes, I absolutely agree with Anthony that there are certain aspects of the genre that are really helpful to you because you instantly have a shorthand with your audience.
Lauren, are you finding that in your projects as well?
Yeah, it's just interesting as I'm, listening to everyone. We have all of that to keep in mind, but then we also are trying to be mindful of an audience in the middle of our country that is highly underrepresented in coastal media. And so you want to be sure that you are that you're representing people in a very authentic way. And Taylor definitely does that. Like, he does all the research and he makes sure that he understands every single aspect of everything that he creates. And he pays a great deal of respect to every single aspect of everything that he creates, and wants to make sure that people are represented and that it feels like they're being represented in an authentic way. But then there's also those tropes that we're talking about, which allow for middle America, for these flyover red states, to have the wish fulfillment, that Anthony was talking about. Like when he would watch Dances with Wolves and he would have, and by the way, I'm not saying like people in middle America are having fantasies about killing natives. I don't mean that. I specifically mean like, everybody loves the idea of like being able to hop on a horse and just like ride through an open prairie with giant mountains covered in snow, and being able to like, wield their weapons, and, maybe not in real life, some in real life, but maybe not in real life, but on the screen, they can see that happening and they can live it and they can experience it. And it's, waking up on the Dutton Ranch and being able to look out and just thinking, God, what would it be like every morning to wake up and be able to smell that nature and just have a cup of coffee like spiked with whiskey. I mean, there are a lot of people in this country that's their idea of wish fulfillment. And so I love hearing all of these, other perspectives, because I think that they're super important. But it is you got to make sure, like on our shows specifically, that we do make sure that we do thread the needle delicately of, like I said, providing for an audience that I think very frequently feels a little bit left out by the coastal elites, for the lack of a better term.
That's great. One of the things that we all seem to have been running into is the fact that Westerns are so difficult to get made today, whether it's series or films. And I really like what Alfredo said about it really speaking to today in terms of representing who we are as a country. I'm wondering if you can talk to Lauren, if you can talk to some of the projects that maybe weren't making it, or a mandate not to do any Westerns, or anybody else who's had a project who's been caught in development hell with it.
It's so funny that I saw this question. And so I started my career at AMC, and I had just arrived there after the success of Broken Trail. And that did extraordinarily well for the network. Nobody saw it coming, but like one of my former colleagues and I always joke, like, you put Robert Duvall on a horse and you got a show. So I grew up in the industry thinking that, Westerns were like a no-brainer. You know, we had that. Then we also had a huge success with Hell on Wheels, both domestically and internationally. I think at the time, I may be speaking out of school here, but I remember it specifically being the second highest sort of fiscally profitable show outside of The Walking Dead for AMC. Hell on Wheels was. So I had those two kind of images in my head of like how successful a Western could be for a network. So when I came to Paramount, and there were internal talks, and that definitely came up. There were people, you know, higher ups that were like, Westerns don't do well. And I'm like, that's so bizarre, because Hell on Wheels and Broken Trail and you know, now we have Longmire and Hatfields and McCoys and Westworld, and oh my God, the list it's endless. And I just kept thinking, where is this coming from? So, and even our marketing materials, when we first, you know, started the whole process on Yellowstone, we were trying to avoid showing that it was a Western for some reason. And I couldn't really get to the bottom of it. I was like, guys, and then sure enough, we presented all the materials to Taylor, and he's like, guys, this is a Western. Like, why aren't that, we should be leaning into that, not leaning out. And I was like, thank you. We should be leaning in. So for me personally, I feel like Westerns for me creatively have always been, I mean, I would honestly say one of my all-time films that I love is Silverado. I mean, I love Westerns, like the potential to, you know, they can be comedies, they can be dramas, they can be, you know, spaghetti Westerns, they can be neo, it doesn't matter. It's like the genre is just really cool. So I do understand that at some places it's kind of like saying, I want to do a sports show, and everybody being like, do we really want to do a sports show? But at our network in particular, we've really, I mean, I'm very proud to say that we've really leaned in and kind of looked around at the landscape, and they do very, very well. So I'm assuming that, you know, 1883 will have, you know, I've seen all the scripts at this point. I think it's going to be, you know, have the same success that Yellowstone will. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but.
I'm looking forward to it. So. Anybody else on the difficulties or anything you've run into or know from people you talk to?
Well, I had an instance where, without getting too much detail, actually, the studio will remain nameless, but I was in the process of developing what I would say is a more traditional period Western with a Latinx lead. And recently was told that yeah, like Lauren alluded to, basically like that might not be the greatest idea, in which case I you know, I did what any writer can relate to, which is pivot. Immediately said, you know, did I mean a period Western? I meant a neo-Western. And they're like, oh yes, great, neo-Western. And so my period Western became a neo-Western. And so, yeah, like, I think that there are definitely, I think I've seen it, I've heard it. I think resistance and a little bit of apprehension about doing something in the Western genre that's more period based. I think maybe that might be driven also by cost. You know, it's just a more expensive project. So, you know, and I think in a world where margins matter more and more, like that might be an instance of them reflecting the fiscal concerns. But yeah, I've had that experience myself.
There was a company that came and spoke with the Native and Indigenous community committee, and the only thing that I heard was that it was internationally. And one of the reasons why they didn't bring up Westerns was that it was because of internationally it doesn't do well. So I don't know how real that was, but that was why they said Westerns, they didn't want to do Westerns, was because of international sales. But, you know, I think with a lot of these trends, it just doesn't make any sense to most people. because we make period pieces all the time, and it really doesn't translate when there's so much of this country that still looks very much exactly the same as it did 100 years ago, and a horse and some costume isn't going to cost that much more. But I also know that people have discussions about wrangling goldfish on television shows, so maybe a bunch of producers are scared about, like, they're just scared, or I don't know what it is, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
I think I could just weigh in on one more thing. It's, I think that we've gotten, I read Bob Iger's book recently, and I was sort of just blown away by his, candor when it came to like how he would program or decide to buy a company. And I think that we've gotten really, caught up lately in metrics. We're such a data-filled environment now, like who would like this and who would like that, and who's watching this and who's watching that, and where numbers are accumulating and where they aren't. And the truth of the matter is, and I'm sort of sad that Scott's not here because I feel like Queen's Gambit, for example, was one of those things that just no one saw coming. And I think that at some point, you have to just make what you think is great, and that's like, if you watch it and it speaks to you and it represents something that you are excited about and that you feel that the world needs to see, I think a little bit more of that could go a long way nowadays. And so, like, exactly what Anthony was saying, like, it's like, it doesn't sell well internationally, except, maybe it would if it was really good. I mean, Hell on Wheels sold very well internationally. So it's just, I think it's, we get caught up in these little numbers games, and I think it could be to our detriment if we're not careful.
Yes, very much. Julia, do you have any desire to go do some Western projects now that you've done The Sun?
Absolutely. I loved it. I loved everything about it. So I was the number 2 in the writer's room. And then I moved to Texas and I was the on-set writer producer for the entire series. So I had the extraordinary opportunity of living in Texas for 2 years with this incredible crew and lots of horses and shooting all over that incredible state. And yes, I would love to do it. But the real reason I would love to do it is something that Alfredo spoke about earlier, which is that for me, and we spoke about this a lot in the writer's room on The Sun, is that Westerns are about how we tell the story of America. And the reason I think we keep making them over and over again is that the way that we want to tell the story of America keeps changing. And that's one of the great powers of the genre, is that it is adaptable in that way. So yes, it's something I think about a lot, especially as we are emerging from this time that will surely go down in American history for what we all just went through. I think about it a lot, like how that would impact how you look at the past. If you're speaking about, creating a period Western now, or how it would inform a neo-Western today. Like, what does a neo-Western look like in the middle of a pandemic or in the wake of the pandemic? So yeah, I think about that a lot.
And Anthony, what would you say to that as well?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that feels like a segue into another topic, which is basically that I 100% agree that, the reason why it's successful in America is because it is uniquely an American thing. Obviously, there are, Alfredo and I, we talked, and he had a lot. We were talking about our near Western. He used the samurai films as a comparison, because that's probably the closest thing international, like from another country that translates pretty closely to Westerns here, and sort of the history of the West, or in this country. And I think Americans are always going to be interested in it, and I think they should be interested in it. And I think it's important. That's why it's important to tell all sides of it, because it is our history. It is the only history that really explains our country, literally from basically 1850 and on. Like that is where so many things happen that affect everything that we're doing today. So I'm 100% that this is the story of America, and it should always be told, and I think it will always just sort of, I guess, like most things in Hollywood, comes in and out of fashion, and we find new ways to tell it, and then we put it on another planet and tell it that way, in different ways as well. So it's high stakes. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy, and it's pretty simple, and it's in the way it's constructed. So yeah.
That's great. Alfredo, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just piggybacking on what Anthony was saying, I mean, I think that one of the allures, I think, of whether a period Western or a neo-Western, and the neo-Westerns that we've mentioned, is I think oftentimes at its heart, like really a Western is a morality tale at a time when we feel like we need more morality. I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, I think that, that was certainly one of the reasons that Anthony and I were working together on this adaptation of this format. The original adaptation comes from Australia. It's a movie called Goldstone, amazing movie. Everybody should go watch it. But it's about an Aboriginal homicide detective who has to return back to the outback where he was from to solve a crime. And it's just such a beautiful movie, and reminded me so much of like those old John Ford movies, except the hero was an Aboriginal homicide detective going back to the outback, But it was a morality tale. It's a morality tale about like what it means to do good in a world that feels very complicated and gray. And I think that's the reason why I think we like Westerns, right? Like, I think it kind of reminds us, as Anthony was saying, like, there's a good guy and there's usually a bad guy. And this is what it means to act heroically, right? And usually those tales involve like a person standing up against forces way larger than themselves, right? In service of things way larger than themselves. And I think that's the power of the Western. And I think that's why a lot of us are trying to appropriate it with different main characters, right? Telling different cultural stories, but the genre feels very applicable. And that's what I have to kind of add to like what the discussion is, in terms of, I think, the attraction to it, particularly right now. And I think if you look across the different shows that are being made, a lot of which have been mentioned now here, but even books, I'm sure you guys have read it. If you guys are a fan of Westerns, it's an amazing book called How Much of These Hills is Gold, which is a Western story told from the eyes of Chinese immigrants. It's like one of the best books I've ever read. And I think they're making it as a TV show, no surprise. But it really is a really compelling book. So anyways, that's what I had to add.
That's great. Lauren, what can I have you add about what Westerns mean and how you can sell them to your folks and beyond?
Oh, I don't have much to add to what everybody was saying. I mean, I think, it both internally and for our audiences, I mean, they're sold. I mean, they're all in. I mean, Yellowstone is does huge numbers for us. And, the sort of feedback that we got when we did the tease for 1883 during the Super Bowl was huge. So I think, I think we're sold. So I don't really have much to add, but I 100% agree with what everybody's saying. It is a way to show our country's history and to maybe right some wrongs that were done in the past, or show all sides of it in a very authentic way. So yeah, it's exciting. It's an exciting time for Westerns, I think.
I definitely think so. I'm sorry, Scott. Frank couldn't be with us today, but if you take a look at his, acclaimed Western miniseries, Godless,
Yeah.
you definitely see a bunch of familiar storylines that get turned on their head. I mean, for example, there's one with a young boy who idolizes a gunslinger and comes of age in that. Or there are outlaws who are threatening a town, or there's a love story with an ex-prostitute. And yet here he turns the town into a real life widow's town, because there were mining towns that had that he actually found, I understand through research, there were mining towns where the entire male population did die. Or when he does his love story with the next prostitute, it's an LGBTQ story. And when he does his Shane-like idolization of a gunslinger, it's a half Native American boy who's coming of age here. So, and I was also impressed in how he brought in the Black Buffalo Soldiers in another coming of age story of a young deputy. So he really is a great example of turning these tropes on their head. And I'd be curious to ask him at some later point which came first, and was he adjusting to the various needs, or was he just which story did he come across first? Because there are several in this miniseries. So I think there are some good examples of really turning the Western on its head a bit. And yet he still had the wonderful outlaw who wants to leave, and the father figure who will not let him go. So does anybody else have some, obviously that's one of my inspirations. Does anybody else have either TV or film inspirations? I know Alfredo, you've talked a little about yours, but if anyone else.
Well, I was, I think what's interesting and great about a show like Godless, and I think what always inspires me in terms of telling the story of America is that I feel like Westerns, when you really look at the history, those stories existed all through the country. Like everywhere you turn, there was an orphan. There was, if you read these historical accounts from people who were buffalo runners, or, former slaves that were trying to get west, or natives who were half-breeds like Quanah Parker, like everything was about survival. And so what I think is great about Westerns, and why I think they are such a great engine to tell good stories and interesting character stories, is because, pretty much anything goes, because anything has happened in the West, and it's all about survival. And what's great about Westerns, and what I wish more Westerns would do, but at the same time, and some of the references I made, like Alzana's Raid and Hombre, and Treasure of Sierra Madre, which was basically, hey, how do our ideals of what society was, coming from the city, or what the city life is used, those ideals don't work in the West. And that's why I think they're great. Mentorship is more important than family sometimes, or blood. a young orphan is adopted by somebody, or he idolizes a gunslinger, not necessarily because he sees the gunslinger as bad, but he sees them as somebody who, you know, is able to make good choices to help him survive. And I think that those stories are so interweaved through America and are so, and sometimes the Western genre will kind of sweep them all away and just be like, yeah, we're just going to tell a story of a lawman and some bad guys who want to steal gold. But, you know, the more interesting ones, like you're saying about Godless, really get into the, like, what actually happened and what are the ways in which survival and how the earth and how this land actually changed the people and forced them to do things that they would never have done in the city or in New York or in the land in the East, which is full of trees and green. And it's in the West where you're in the plains and there's nothing around and you have to survive. And how are you going to do that? Both in the capitalism way, like gold and cattle, but also in the native way, which is literally how are you going to drink water, find food, and get to where you need to go, and who's going to help you get there. And I think that that's why those storylines can exist, and I think that's why there's so much freedom to me in a Western, and where I generally tend to go, because I feel so strongly about those storylines, like you said, and that's generally what I like to write as well. Those people who shouldn't be there, but that find a way to survive.
Julia, do you have any other inspirations that come from Western TV or movies or?
I found a lot of books that we ended up reading for research to be incredibly inspirational. Like, if anyone hasn't read Howard Zinn's, People's History of the United States, I really hugely recommend it. All of T.R. Fehrenbach's books about the West, the Comanches and Lone Star, his book about Texas. Because just to add to everything, all the smart things everyone is saying, is that the Western genre are our myths. They are America's myths. And so I just find it very inspiring to look back, like as far back as I can possibly get, the earliest myths that were told about America, and see how we can change them and adapt them. And by doing so, like, contribute to how the myths are then perpetuated going forward.
That was great. Okay, I think we have a couple of questions that we can try to address. And one of them is mentioning that The Unforgiven is considered to be a turning point in the history of the Western, but it was released almost 30 years ago. What do you think are the most significant Westerns of more recent years, and how did they change the genre? Alfredo?
That's a great question. I mean, I honestly think that the more significant, I guess, newer Westerns, I think, tend to be neo-Westerns. I mean, I just like No Country for Old Men, or obviously the cultural impact that Yellowstone's making. I think those have been the more significant, impactful, I think, representations of Westerns. I will say that on a kind of a personal level, there are more obscure Westerns that I've seen recently that have really impacted me. Like, there was a movie that came out a few years ago called The Sisters Brothers. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was like one of those like truly genuinely mind-blowing experiences. And I think the reason that my mind was blown was it was a period Western, but it was so rethought. Like, they were kind of like sci-fi elements, and they were kind of like, like philosophical elements to it, that I found it really inspirational and kind of freeing, in that, like, what this movie was telling me was, hey man, like, you can take the genre and do whatever you want with it, the genre can accommodate it. And I was just so inspired by that movie. I mean, just everything about it is phenomenal. I don't know that anybody saw it, but the book is amazing too. But I would say, like, probably I would list probably the Western, the neo-Westerns that most people would list, but like The Sisters Brothers for me was most recently like the most impactful Western that I've seen.
Anthony?
Most recently, I'm a pretty tough judge when it comes to like the stories that the Westerns are telling. So I can't really say anything has personally changed my personal opinions about Westerns, but it does, I think, shows like Scott's, like Godless, or other or even actually, sorry, Hell on Wheels. Like, I think when I saw that, and I saw that they were telling the story of the Black railroad workers, and they were really getting into sort of what these other characters that were generally left out. When I saw those being told, that more just gave me hope that, like, hey, I'll be able to write my Western or my a story where I can also tell those characters as well. And I will say, like, I think Dances with Wolves, again, it was seminal in that because it did spend a lot of time with the Native characters and Native perspective, so that you understood what their experiences and where they were coming from and what they were thinking about in that storyline, in the historical context of the film. So, yeah.
I see that Scott's now joined us. Hello, Scott. It's nice to see you.
I'm so sorry, everybody. I don't know how to tell time. I'm really I had 5 p.m. in my brain, not 4 p.m. 4 p.m. in the calendar, but 5 p.m. I'm very sorry. Can we start over? Let's start over, shall we?
We're going to start over with you with some questions that we've already addressed, but are part of our general questions here about how we basically tell stories in a Western context without using tropes that would be culturally unacceptable today, and how do we get underrepresented people and perspectives into a Western. And I specifically wanted to mention for you in terms of Godless, which is what we've all been praising here before you came on. You have a number of classic Western storylines, the coming of age story of a boy who idolizes the gunslinger, outlaws terrorizing a town, a love story with an ex-prostitute, but you added the perspectives of those who got historically excluded. How and why did you do it, and what came first?
I mean, it's interesting because this is maybe the only time I can remember I decided to write something simply because I wanted to write in that genre. So I really didn't have the story. I didn't know anything. Once, we started, I have a woman I work with who does research. And once we started our research and Mimi found this town that really existed where everybody had died in the mine, that's where I really kind of it all began to coalesce. But to your point, I wanted to embrace all the tropes because I was so into the genre, and because I so wanted to write in this particular genre. I wanted to hit every cliche I could think of. And for a year, while I was researching and kind of thinking about what the story was going to be, I read nothing but Westerns. And just to collect and gather and catalog all the various tropes and moments about horsebreaking and about, the gunfight where two people face each other, and about, anything, all the things you mentioned. And so I thought it would be fun to do them, but do them in a different way. What if the prostitute was in love with another woman? You know, what if it was different things like that all the way through it? What if, you know, it was about family, but it was about, you know, the family you choose, and in this case a family who chose you, who's awful, you know, all of these kinds of things I just wanted to play with. And again, all the tropes. And it's tricky because you want to avoid certain things that will bump people out because they don't realize it's period correct, but it's just no longer okay. And there's a fine line between being just outright horrible and being period correct, but being horrible. And there's a time where you're somehow making your audience aware that, you know, this is an anachronism that happened then, but would not, you know, doesn't happen today. And it's a very tricky, hard line. And sometimes I got it right, and sometimes I think I was clumsy with it. But the Western, for me, what's great about it is it's one of the few genres, maybe film noir, that you can do in any period. You know, I look at Logan as a Western. You know, there are certain things you can do, a futuristic Western. You can do anything you want because the genre is about place, and sort of the place being a major character, and the rawness and danger and availability of sudden danger being, you know, the Wild West is a term that we use for a lot of things now.
That's great. And did you have any pushback when you told representatives to studios, to networks, that you wanted to do a Western? We've been talking about how tough it is to make a Western series or film today.
Well, I started this in 2002 and finished it in 2004. And two significant things. I remember telling my agent at the time, I told her, I'm going to take a year or two off and write something on spec, write an original. I really want to do an original. And she said, that sounds great, as long as it's not a Western. And then I spent forever trying to get it made. It wasn't until I started thinking about it as a miniseries, and Netflix, in the same week, both Netflix and HBO wanted to do it as a miniseries. It was very strange. And they sort of found me, and I had been out there trying to get it made forever, and nobody wanted to make a Western. Westerns don't travel, is what you're told. You know, they don't like them overseas and so on. You know, Quentin Tarantino is different. He gets to make a Western, you don't. And so it was really hard. The budget, it wasn't cheap, you know, it was a big story. And I think I was saved from myself by doing it as a miniseries, because I think the story would have lost quite a bit as a film, because it wouldn't have fit in the format. It was a very long screenplay already. So I think that the limited series is a great way to do genres and subjects and stories that people avoid in the movies. I keep describing it as you're adapting a novel into another kind of novel. That's really what you're doing.
And in this case, you wrote the novel.
In this case, I wrote the novel.
That is great. Can you talk a little bit, Scott, about your influences? Well, you said you read nothing but Westerns. Were there any particular favorites or ones you wanted to follow more than others?
Man, there were a lot. There's a Western called Rules, and I'm blanking on the writer, of course. He wrote two books. The Scout was the sequel, and it was amazing, and it taught me a lot about horsebreaking and the language of horsebreaking, the language of horses, and how cowboys thought about horses, but also about survival, about, you know, different kinds of trees, and it had great phrases and things that, because I didn't want to do, the dialogue is the thing that's the hardest to do, because you end up going, I reckon we'll wrestle up a bunch of grub, you know, and you're like, oh, and you're trying to figure out how to do something that sounds accurate and real, but doesn't sound like, you know, an episode of Gunsmoke. So reading the books was a great way. I loved Little Big Man. I thought that was fantastic. I read Deadwood, which was written by Pete Dexter, which the TV show kind of used but didn't use. It's the same story, but Pete's story is unbelievable, and the characters in it. I read my researcher found me a lot of books on mining and stories about miners, and some of them were really funny. Stories about these kind of city folk coming west to these various mines and how they worked and the language of the mines. And so you just read it all, because what you're looking for, you can get lost in research. If you start trying to tell your story because you want people to know how cool it is to mine ore or something, you're in trouble. And we have all been lost in our research. But what you find are the telling details that are really interesting. You find these little things that you can write about that don't feel like you're showing off your research, And a lot of times I'm watching things and I go, wow, they're really just telling me what they've Googled. And I think that, all of that kind of stuff is the tricky part. And that's really what you're trying to navigate the whole time.
Thank you, Scott. We have a couple of questions that we've actually, one that was being answered while you came in, so I'll ask you. Hold on, where is that question? The question was that the Unforgiven was a turning point, considered a turning point in telling Westerns again, but it came out 30 years ago. What current or more recent films or television shows, besides yours, do you think is also changing the genre, and how?
Is it still me?
Yeah, still you. We're making up for your being late.
Okay, I just don't want to be that guy.
You're not that guy. You're absolutely not that guy.
Unforgiven is a masterpiece. It's like one of the 5 perfect movies that I've seen in my life. It's really great. The script is great. The movie is great. There's not a wrong moment in it. I love it. Since then, I don't know if there's anything that I've really liked that's a Western. I think Django is a kind of Western, but it's very modern in its sensibility. Unforgiven for me is is Polaris. It's the North Star. It really is an amazing script. But I love Shane. I love so many different Westerns, over the years. I love Butch Cassidy, which is also a very contemporary sounding Western, but really great. We could go on, because I also watched one Western a day for a year. And, foreign Westerns, American Westerns, Japanese Westerns, I watched them all. And again, there's so many good ones and interesting ones that I'd never heard of that were just great. So, but Unforgiven is the one. That really is the one. And the only book I did not read until after I made the show was Larry McMurtry's book,
Lonesome Dove.
Lonesome Dove. And I'm so glad, because had I read it before, I would have just stopped. I would have said there's really no need to do anything else after this, because it is as Unforgiven is a perfect movie, it's a perfect novel. And you look foolish trying to do what he did. But yeah, I think we're stuck in Unforgiven for me, unless all of you have your favorites, have another favorite.
Yeah, I think we've gone over some of them, like the Sister Brothers and Hell or High Water. And Anthony, did you have a more recent one?
The Sisters
Cowboys
Brothers,
and Aliens.
right? The Sisters Brothers is
Yeah.
The Sisters Brothers is very good. I actually like Lonesome Slow West. I thought was terrific. Hell or High Water is a modern one though. You know, that's the modern.
But also, oh yes, Julia.
Yeah, I just want to add, obviously Unforgiven is incredible, and I absolutely agree that it occupies its own kind of special space. But one that just had a huge impact on me, kind of in the early days of me figuring out how to be a writer, if I wanted to be a writer, was Thelma and Louise.
Which ones?
Thelma and Louise.
Oh, that's a great movie. That's a perfect movie too. I mean, that's just perfect.
Movie.
Yeah, that's a Western with wet down streets.
Yeah, exactly.
And somehow lighting in Monument Valley. But other than that, I love that movie with every fiber. I think it's amazing. A great dialogue. It does feel like a Western, does that.
One of the other questions we have from our audience is asking about Western comedies that parody many of the tropes and stereotypes to subvert them. What are your thoughts on Western comedies, if you are familiar with them?
Well, I mean, Blazing Saddles. I mean,
yes.
I mean, I don't know if there's anything better than that. I'm trying to think of a Western. I don't think about Western comedy so much.
Silverado is really funny.
Silverado is hilarious.
It's hilarious.
I love
it's
Silverado.
Like vintage Lawrence Kasdan. It is so good.
It's very good, but very modern too. The way people talk and the way but I love it. I love Silverado too. That's a lot of fun. Oh, I know what I love. Not as much as Unforgiven, but a lot is the Coen brothers' True Grit. Their version of True Grit I thought was spectacular. I just loved it, every second of it. I was so happy to be there.
Yeah, well, there's also a TV show coming out in its third season. I was just looking it up just so I could remember the name of it. Miracle Workers, where I feel like they're I haven't watched it yet, but I know it's about the Oregon Trail and it's a comedy, and it seems to me, and just in a quick preview of it, we had one of our committee members write on the show, and I saw some comedic moments in there with Wes Studi and a couple others. So I personally would love to see a new updated version of what I would love to see what a new contemporary Blazing Saddles would look like. Right. And I think there's a lot of great.
Little Big Man is funny. Little Big Man is the catch-22 of Westerns. It's really hysterical and just wild. Somebody I see just mentioned Capaloo. I like Capaloo too. And I also see Harry Combs is the writer of Brules and The Scout. So if you like reading Westerns, thank you for that.
Yeah, a lot of my family loved Little Big Man too, but that was 30 years ago, so I got to go rewatch it. I remember laughing at something, so
it's pretty great. The book is amazing. I mean, the book is just incredible. I'm forgetting, whenever you get asked this stuff, you immediately forget everything you've ever read or seen. So I'm sure when we're done, I'll have a nice long list for you.
We'll take it. One of the other questions is, for those of us who have spec Western features and pilots, many of us, what do you recommend as next steps? Because we are all told that nobody wants Westerns, even though the marketplace doesn't bear this out. And any tips? Where to go? No, anybody, but anybody jump in on that one if they have any tips for how to kind of break in. Is it through a producer? Is it getting attachments? Is it
I think if you asked 50 of us hacks how we sold something, or the first something, or what our first thing was, you'll get 50 completely different stories. I think they'll all be really different. And I don't know that there is a single way. I'm a big believer in the if you write it, they will come model, and ignoring what people say people are buying. Nobody knows what anybody's buying, and they change their mind, and everybody is chasing what everybody else is chasing, and there's nothing like a really well-written script of any genre to change people's minds. I mean, who would have back in the day, however many years ago, would have thought, oh, a Gladiator movie, everybody wants to see it. I remember when Universal was making Gladiator, I thought, oh my God, that sounds like the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. And that movie is amazing because the genre means nothing. It's a great story told in that genre, in that world that you've never seen, in again, a well thought out, completely rendered world. And so if you focus on the writing, everything changes.
I just said this before you hopped on, Scott. Like, I think that, as an executive, the whole landscape of buying shows and making shows has completely changed. And many people are being replaced at high levels by people who can say that they can predict the market, with metrics. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're all going to wind up going back to creative people at the end of the day, because the truth of the matter is, and you are the perfect example of this, there is not a person in the world that could have predicted the success of Queen's Gambit. There is not a single person. I mean, at the last time I checked, 60 million people had watched that. I mean, come on, like it's just gotta be good. Like, that's literally it. And that's what I literally, every writer that comes to me that says, with an unpopular genre, I'm like, just write it well, and you will find someone internally that is like, I have to make this. And that voice is the voice that's going to get it made. It's just the truth. It's what you said about just cut out the noise. Stop listening to what everybody's telling you. Warren Buffett says it best. You can't predict the market. Nobody can, not even the best. You just got to look on the page, and if it's there, it will get made. And if it's not, it won't. That's absolutely right.
And a good script will sell you, even if it doesn't sell itself. Even if people are afraid of the genre or whatever, but they read a great script, you're going to work.
That's right.
And, I've made a career out of answering questions no one is asking. So, just because I wanted to tell these stories, and I really do believe it. If you really focus on the writing and writing well, and you can't do that, the podcasts and the seminars and the books, the weekends with, what's his name, Robert McKee and all, they do not work, because they're about analyzing things after the fact, not creating them. And what you just alluded to about the people using algorithms and so on, or marketing, once you start using marketing to decide what to make, everything becomes the same. It's the snake that eats its own tail.
You go from having a banana split to vanilla ice cream. That's what we always say.
And that's it. And so, because everybody is following the same rules, and an algorithm is great when you have an original piece of material and you want to study how people come to it and watch it and what they watched before and so on. But to use those things to decide what to make it's never worked ever, and yet it feels the safest. It's one of those things that for some reason people believe it, the way they believe it's more dangerous to fly than to drive, but I do think that if you're writing, and now is the time to be a writer. I was just saying this to someone the other day. There's so many stories. There's not only so many stories being made, you can see that the world loves stories. Podcasts are huge, and that's like old radio, and the real tell is documentaries, because documentaries have become hugely popular. And not so long ago, you'd say, do you want to watch a documentary? And people would go, no. And now they're as addictive as anything, because they're curating character. They're gathering all these little bits of story. They're all focused not on sort of servicing a concept or anything. They're focused on, let's get all this character and all this detail. and then we'll shape it into a story. Whereas if you study all these things and listen to the podcasts and listen to the rules, which are nonsense, you're using things that worked on other stories, you know, this whole, I love, what's the phrase, inciting incident? I had to look that up when people started using that. And, you know, you should have your inciting incident by page 20 or whatever. No, by page 10 or whatever. But Melvin and Howard has like a 30-page opening scene, you know? And so I think that if you're starting and you're trying to write a Western, the genre is irrelevant. I would say, don't think of how do I sell a genre. Think about how do I write a great script and tell a great story, because that will serve you way longer than selling anything. See, I've become that guy.
You're still absolutely not that guy. We had a lot of ground to cover. A quick question here. Do you think there's more of an appetite for Westerns in the TV market than the feature market? It's going back to markets, but just sort of broadly. Or let's put it this way, are Westerns a better fit for, let's say, limited series or TV series, or are there still great ways to do films as well?
I think every story is unique, and I think you have to be agnostic in terms of what the format is going to be. I don't know, movies are moving more into the kind of superhero of it all because the people going are younger more than anything, you know, and the movie going experience has gotten, you know, not so good. And so I don't know. I'm sure there could be a Western that would be a great film that would get people out of the house to go see it. I don't know if you can think about it. You kind of think about your story, and is this a story that would work great in 2 hours, or is this a story I want to tell over 5 days or 6 days or 6 hours or whatever? And you have to be disciplined, though. You can't just make it longer because you want to. You have to make it longer because it needs to be longer. And we've all seen limited series, including my own, where there's a lot of extra stuff that maybe if you had been a little more vigilant, you might have cut out.
I mean, I imagine it would be, a lot of it would be, you know, who wants to play those parts as well. I mean, right? It's like you got somebody who wants to be in a film, or they want to play a Western character for 10 episodes. You know, I think that comes down to a lot of decision making as well, which seems, you know, is pretty standard across anything you're trying to make. You know, people were very, I remember talking to people who were super excited about Deadwood the movie because they loved the show. And then, you know, so I think it's just like, who wants to be in those films, who wants to do those projects? So, I mean, Tom Hanks, someone mentioned News of the World. It's like, Tom Hanks wants to do a Western, you know, it's going to be a film probably. It's not going to be a TV show.
Exactly. Although that might have been a better TV show. And what's interesting about television is it makes the stars. You can have people who was in Bridgerton, you know. you can have, television makes the stars, and the notion that you need a star to make a show work is less important. And I wonder if that's not also true in the feature world. I don't know. But it is interesting to see what's happening. Nothing has landed yet. We're in this, you know, the plate tectonics are shaky. You know, everything is changing every week. There's something new, and they're trying a new release pattern, you know, and theater owners are saying, well, they would have made more money if they'd given us Black Widow exclusively. And now, you know, and they're experimenting with how they pay us, or more importantly, don't pay us. And so there's all this, it's all moving right now. I think it's hard to locate yourself. You kind of have to do it one at a time right now. Just focus on one thing at a time you can't guess the market. That's the bottom line. You just can't.
One other question is, how would each of you define what a Western is today, whether or not it's considered commercial or not? Like, the sister brothers weren't, or anything like that. What to you makes a Western? We've touched on a lot of what it is that makes a Western relevant. Alfredo, Anthony, you've talked about that. If you could maybe bring that up again to just give an idea of what to you is a Western simply today. Anthony, can I hit on you?
Sure. I think the quick answer would be, one, just like somebody who embodies the ideals of what I think we feel Westerns is. So somebody who's like on their own, that always feels like a Mandalorian. He's a bounty hunter. Someone that follows in those rules of like the law is fluid in a certain way. And also I think, most Westerns are set outside of a city. Obviously some of our neo ones are a little bit like Deputy was set in Los Angeles, but lead character played by his own rules rode a horse. So that kind of made it a Western. So generally outside of a city where the rules can be, the system is not what everyone is following.
Julia? You can repeat what you've said. You've said a lot of great things.
Oh, well, I love this question, by the way, because I love thinking about sort of genre in this way. I would say it's a character that has a very strong sense of him or herself, and then, encounters the wildness of whatever particular landscape they're in. And then through that interaction, their sense of themselves changes, that character changes like in relationship to the place. For me, that's what kind of strings most Westerns together.
Alfredo?
I think that's a really hard question to answer. For me, I think that you can have certain elements of how we would define a Western. It usually includes like outsiders kind of operating in a really dangerous situation, trying to overcome or redress some kind of injustice. But I honestly, I think it's more of a feel than it is like specific elements. So, Scott mentioned this before, like that we apply the term Wild West, right? Like to a lot of things. And like it's I think it was Justice Stewart who said, like, what is obscenity? Well, I'll know it when I see it. I kind of feel like the same way about like, is that a Western? Well, I'll know it when I see it. Right. Like, because I think it has a sense of like the Wild West, right? And that could be a period Western. That could be a contemporary neo, as we call it, a neo-Western. That could take place in space, right? And I think that it's like basically this sense of operating in a jungle, and I think we wrap the tale in a kind of morality tale, right? I think that's just kind of like loosely how I would define it. And so for me, it's more of a feel than like a strict definition, but.
Great. No, that's perfect. Scott?
I think Alfredo said it best. I think that's exactly what it is. Most of these things are just a feel. Most things are, that's why I go back to, you can't learn that stuff. You just have to know it and feel it, and the rest is craft that you can learn in a weekend. But the other stuff, you either have a kind of sense for tone and genre and things, or you can learn it by steeping yourself in it. I really do think that, because a lot of this is a way of thinking. And if you're already a writer and a storyteller, you kind of, if you immerse yourself in the way of thinking, you're kind of thinking like a Western writer, at least that was my experience. But I do think there's no real definition. There's just a feel, certain things have this feeling of a Western or a film noir or something, and you see those terms applied to genres of all movies and stories of all period because of that. So I think that's a a great way of looking at it. You kind of know it when you see it.
Lauren, can I ask you just to weigh in if you have any other opinion?
Sure. I mean, I don't have too much to add. I would just say that, not only as just like an executive who works on, Taylor Sheridan, works in Taylor Sheridan's world, I think that what I love the most about what he does is that there's, I mean, Hell or High Water, Yellowstone, now it'll be 1883 and more to come. There's always this sense of romanticism and adventure. I am never, I'm just a fan. Like, I really thoroughly enjoy working on his shows. Because to me, it's a gift that I get to watch these cuts and work on these scripts. And it really is like this, obviously all of the character development and the tapestry of like the country and retelling history and all of that is so very important, of course. But that, I mean, I fell in love with film at a very young age because it's how my father learned to speak English. And like, anything with scope or adventure or the romanticism of America is just, it's really cool in all of its like ugliness and beauty and hope and danger, and Westerns really capture that on every level. And for me, like I said, it feels like a gift to be able to work on these shows. It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
That's great. Let's see, I think there are a lot of comments about the Chinese Western book, how much of these hills is gold, and it definitely looks like a lot of our participants are going to start reading books about Westerns as well as just watching them, which is great. I guess we're close to wrapping up, but I'm curious, would Scott and others, would you try a Western again? Or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. And it just depends. Again, the genre for me is the magic cape you hide your story in. It's all different. It's and if there was something, if I came to something that I really felt was wanted to be a Western, or wanted to adapt something that was a Western, I would absolutely do it. I'm working with some folks, on a Bass Reeves story, who's somebody I've always been fascinated with. But you never know, you never know. I think I would do it again. I don't know how you all feel, but it's maybe my favorite genre. It's quite the sandbox to play in. I mean, I'm jealous of Tyler Sheridan because he has all those ideas that take him back to that sandbox, and they're all good. And my sandbox took me from the Old West to a board game. So,
anyone else? You all are. Julia, I think you said you would try again.
Yeah, for sure. I love the genre.
Being from Nevada, being in the West, growing up riding horses, doing rodeo, I don't think there's, I have yet to see enough of the Western stories that I want to see. So I actually probably have a harder time getting out of the West than I do. Everything I've worked on so far has either been a neo-Western, a historical fiction Western, anime, or set in the West, or everything has that feel to it, and that's probably just because that's the world I come from and I know. But at the same time, I have a lot to say about it. So at this point, that's just kind of the world I'm living in, and I'm happy to be there. And like you said, Scott, I wrote my Western feature just on my own because that was the story I wanted to tell. So we'll see what happens. But at the end of the day, like that's what speaks to me mostly. But I think there's so many things in there that translate, that can be used for all different types of genres and stories. So.
Yeah, I would say since I'm working with Anthony, I'm definitely on the Western kick. We're working on something together. But yeah, I mean, I wrote my spec. A Bad Hombre was a spec feature that if I had ever pitched it to my agents or my manager, they would have tried to like talk me out of it for sure. And then I ended up getting a bunch of meetings with it. But I think it goes back to what Scott said and Lauren said, which is, at the end of the day, are you telling a very specific story in your voice? Like it, and you can't, there's no amount of market research that will give you the right answer to how to write a script that speaks to you specifically in your own voice. Like there is no market. You are the market. Like, so you're a market of one. And I think the mistake that writers often make is that thinking that they have to fit within a larger market, when in reality, we're all as writers market of one. And is it a story that you feel compelled to write at the end of the day? And I feel like Westerns to me right now are the things that I'm focusing on. Because like I said before, I think they're, I don't know, it seems like the genre most appropriate to things I'm thinking about in today's world. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I'll make it really easy for younger writers. If you just focus on telling a story you like, it may not get made right away. It may not get made ever, but if you really see it through, it's going to be good for you. It's going to be really good for you. As opposed to if you try and guess what people want, you're kind of a hack at that point. So, because you're just trying to guess what people want. And you're the only touchstone you have is your own taste and your own point of view and so on. And that's scarier, but I think you bet on yourself. It sometimes takes a long, long time. The last two things, one I tried to make 20 years ago, one I tried, as I said, back in 2004. Stuff happens when it's supposed to happen, but if you focus on writing, I can't say this enough, if you just focus on that and you don't worry about sort of how you're going to set it up or any of those things, it's bizarre how the world changes. It's bizarre. And the only common denominator you'll get if you ask 50 successful people what it was way back, it was they loved this one story that they worked on until it was something they were proud to show people and never had to run in front of, and with whatever the genre was. And that makes it easy. And all the other rules and things, that's for examining it after you've written it a little bit.
Well, I think the takeaway here is that Westerns are a robust genre, even in the 21st century, and even with the changes that we see culturally, and because of the changes we see culturally. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for spending the time with us to go over it. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Alfredo. And thank you, Scott, so much for being here.
Sorry I was late. I owe you all something nice.
We'll just we'll get you back on another panel someday.
Happily, and I'll be there early. I'll be sitting there waiting an hour before.
Good. Well, you are in New York, so we have to give you that. Of course, sometime maybe we'll actually go back to having in-person panels back at the Guild again, and we'll just Zoom you in from there.
I'll do it. I'll do it. Very nice meeting all of you. I hope I get to see you in person someday.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.